The heart monitor dissolved into a single unbroken tone that pierced the sterile antiseptic air of the Veterans Affairs ward, stretching the silence until it felt heavy enough to crack the pale green linoleum floor beneath Naomi Bell's boots. She kept her eyes fixed on the rhythmic, mechanical rise and fall of her father's chest, her thumb tracing the frayed, coffee-stained edge of the DD-214 discharge paper that rested against her knuckles, feeling the raised ink of the red stamp that had dictated the trajectory of their entire lives. Colonel Samuel Bell lay beneath the thin, institutional blanket, his skin the color of old ash, his breathing reduced to a shallow, rattling gasp that fought against the plastic oxygen cannula resting beneath his nose, while the fluorescent lights above hummed with a low electrical vibration that seemed to rattle the very fillings in Naomi's teeth. She did not reach out to hold his hand, knowing how much even the slightest pressure of a cotton blanket had irritated his swollen joints over the past 3 weeks. So she kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigidly straight, her jaw locked so tightly that a dull ache radiated from her temples down to the base of her neck. The paper in her hands was a Department of Defense form, officially documenting the end of a 30-year career, but the red ink screaming dishonorable discharge across the bottom margin was the only thing that mattered, a bureaucratic execution that had stripped him of his pension, his rank, and his reputation, leaving him to wither in a government hospital, while the men who had orchestrated his ruin continued to pin stars onto their collars. A cold sheen of sweat broke across Naomi's hairline, tracing a slow, icy path down the side of her neck, but she did not wipe it away, her gaze shifting from the paper to the digital readout of the vital signs monitor, watching the green line spike erratically before dipping into a dangerous, shallow valley. The air in the room smelled of rubbing alcohol, stale lavender air freshener, and the distinct metallic tang of failing organs, a combination that coated the back of her throat and made her swallow hard against the sudden, sharp taste of copper. Footsteps approached from the hallway, the rubber soles of nursing shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor, a mundane, rhythmic sound that clashed violently with the monumental finality occurring within the 4 walls of room 412. The heavy wooden door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a young orderly pushing a cart laden with fresh linens and plastic-wrapped medication cups, the wheels of the cart rattling loudly against the threshold before he finally noticed the stillness in the room. He stopped abruptly, his hand freezing on the handle of the cart, his eyes darting from the flatlining monitor to Naomi's impassive face, the plastic cup of pills slipping from his fingers to clatter loudly against the metal baseboard, spilling white tablets across the floor in a chaotic scatter. Naomi did not turn her head to look at him, her focus entirely consumed by the space between her father's parted lips, waiting for the final, shuddering exhale that would signal the end of a war he had never truly been allowed to leave. The monitor's tone shifted pitch, dropping into a lower, more resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the metal bed frame and into the soles of Naomi's boots, signaling the final cessation of electrical activity in the myocardium. The orderly fumbled for the call button on the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid, but Naomi simply reached out with a steady hand and pressed the silence button on the monitor, cutting off the electronic wail and replacing it with the profound, suffocating quiet of the room, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of a gurney rolling down the corridor. She looked at the clock on the wall, noting the exact time with a detached, clinical precision, committing the numbers to memory before sliding the DD-214 into the inner pocket of her jacket, feeling the stiff paper press against her ribs like a physical weight. Rising from the edge of the mattress with a deliberate slowness that masked the violent trembling in her calves, she navigated the narrow space between the bed and the humming oxygen concentrator to reach the small plastic basin holding her father's personal effects. She picked up his silver wristwatch, the crystal scratched from decades of field deployments, and his dog tags, the metal cold and heavy against her palm, the sound of the chains clinking together, providing a sharp, metallic punctuation to the silence. She placed the items into her pocket alongside the discharge papers, her movements methodical and precise, refusing to let her fingers linger on the fabric of his hospital gown. Knowing that any hesitation would shatter the fragile, icy composure she had constructed to survive the last 24 hours. The orderly was still on his knees, gathering the scattered pills, his shoulders shaking with unspoken sympathy. But Naomi merely stepped around him, her boots clicking sharply against the linoleum as she walked toward the door, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon of a battle that had only just begun. The rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof of the storage unit with a deafening, relentless intensity, transforming the small windowless space into an echo chamber of drumming water and rolling thunder, while a single, flickering fluorescent tube cast long, wavering shadows across the concrete floor. Naomi stood in the center of the 10 by 10 space, the damp chill of the November air seeping through her wool coat, her breath plumbing in faint, white clouds that dissolved quickly in the drafty atmosphere. Before her sat a heavy steel lockbox, its surface mottled with rust and decades of neglect, the padlock securing its hasp seized tight by oxidation and time. She knelt on the damp concrete, the cold immediately biting through the knees of her trousers, and retrieved a heavy steel wrench from the canvas bag at her feet, positioning the jaw of the tool over the shackle of the lock. With a sharp, violent exhalation, she pulled the wrench downward, the metal groaning in protest before the rusted shackle snapped with a sharp, echoing crack that momentarily cut through the sound of the rain, the sudden release of tension sending a jolt of pain up her forearms. She set the broken lock aside and lifted the heavy lid of the box, the hinges shrieking in a high, metallic pitch that made her teeth ache, revealing the interior lined with faded green velvet and stacked meticulously with the physical remnants of a destroyed career. Inside the box lay 3 cassette tapes with handwritten labels peeling at the edges, a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy black redaction bars of the Judge Advocate General's office, and a silver Zippo lighter, its surface engraved with the crest of the artillery unit her father had commanded before the tribunal. Naomi reached past the tapes and the redacted memos, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy metal of the lighter, the familiar weight of it instantly transporting her back to the wooden porch of their cramped duplex in Fayetteville, nearly 15 years prior. The memory washed over her with the vivid clarity of a photograph, the air thick with the smell of impending thunderstorms and the sharp, clean scent of her father's gun oil and cheap aftershave, while Samuel sat in his faded uniform, the stars on his collar polished to a mirror shine, his large, calloused hands carefully cleaning the silver lighter with a soft cloth. He had looked up at her, his eyes dark and heavy with a burden he had never fully explained, and pressed the lighter into her palm, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sound of the cicadas in the yard. He had told her that men in Washington and generals in the Pentagon bury the truth in paperwork, stacking redactions and classified stamps over their sins until the paper becomes a tomb, and that she must never let them chisel his name into that tomb without digging up the facts they tried to hide. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Naomi kneeling on the cold concrete of the storage unit, the silver lighter heavy in her hand, the rain continuing its relentless assault on the tin roof above. She opened the lighter with a sharp flick of her thumb, the metallic clink sharp and clear, and struck the flint wheel, the spark catching the wick and blooming into a steady, orange flame that cast dancing shadows across the rusted walls of the unit. Naomi held the lighter steady in the draft, watching the blue base of the flame flicker until her breathing slowed and the violent fog of grief narrowed into one hard point of resolve. Then she snapped it shut, the sharp click echoing in the small space, her face remaining a mask of absolute terrifying stillness. Naomi snapped the lighter shut, the sharp click echoing in the small space, and placed it back into the velvet-lined box alongside the cassette tapes and the redacted JAG summaries, her thumb leaving a faint smudge of soot on the silver casing. She closed the heavy steel lid, the hinges whining in protest once more, and picked up the broken padlock, threading the hasp through the hole and securing it with a new, heavy-duty combination lock she had brought in her bag. Spinning the dials until the numbers aligned with a series of satisfying mechanical clicks. Lifting the heavy box with both hands, ignoring the strain in her shoulders and the ache in her hands, she carried it out of the storage unit and into the bed of her waiting truck, the rain instantly soaking through her coat and plastering her hair to her forehead. She slammed the tailgate shut, the loud metallic bang swallowed immediately by the thunder rolling across the darkened sky, and climbed into the driver's seat, the leather cold and damp against her back. As she turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life and the heater blasting stale, dusty air against the windshield, Naomi did not look back at the storage facility, her eyes fixed entirely on the dark, rain-slicked highway ahead, the weight of the steel box in the bed behind her serving as both an anchor to the past and the ammunition for the war she was about to wage. The recruitment office radiated a stifling, stagnant heat that seemed to press against the peeling beige wallpaper, the wall-mounted air conditioning unit rattling violently in its plastic casing, while expelling nothing but a faint, dusty breeze that carried the scent of old carpet and stale coffee. Naomi Bell sat rigidly in the molded fiberglass chair opposite the recruiter's desk, her spine perfectly aligned with the seam of the chair's backrest, her hands resting flat on her thighs to conceal the slight rhythmic trembling in her fingers that had persisted since she left the storage unit in the pre-dawn darkness. Across the scarred laminate desk, Recruiter First Class Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the glowing monitor of his desktop computer, the rapid, staccato clatter of his keystrokes filling the small room while he navigated the Department of Defense accession database, occasionally pausing to take a loud, wet sip from a styrofoam cup that bore the faded logo of a local car dealership. The fluorescent light above them flickered with a low, electrical buzz that seemed to vibrate directly against Naomi's molars, casting a sickly pale green pallor over the stacks of recruitment brochures and the framed certificates of achievement that lined the walls, all of them detailing the heroic transformations of young men and women who had willingly surrendered their civilian autonomy to the machinery of the United States Army. Her mind drifted momentarily to the rhythmic, shallow breathing of her 6-year-old daughter, Maya, who was currently sleeping in the back seat of their idling, 10-year-old sedan parked just outside the office window. The child's blue plastic asthma inhaler resting on the passenger seat like a silent physical reminder of the medical debts that the stolen military pension was supposed to have covered. Naomi had spent the last 3 hours at the kitchen table calculating the exact velocity at which her inherited trust fund would be depleted by Maya's specialized pulmonary treatments and the exorbitant premiums of the civilian health insurance market, realizing with cold mathematical certainty that the billions of dollars her father had quietly accumulated through decades of private investments could buy her daughter comfort, but it could never buy the systemic vindication required to scrub the red dishonorable discharge stamp from Samuel Bell's permanent federal record, a stain that would inevitably trigger automated security clearance denials for Maya whenever she attempted to enter government service or secure a federal scholarship. The inheritance was a fortress of capital, but it was entirely useless against the impenetrable bureaucratic armor of the Judge Advocate General's Corps and the entrenched network of white officers who had conspired to destroy her father, meaning the only way to dismantle the machine was to crawl into its gears, memorize its mechanisms, and wait for the precise moment to introduce a single, unbreakable wrench into its most vulnerable, load-bearing joint. Recruiter Hayes cleared his throat, a harsh, grating sound that snapped Naomi's attention back to the cramped office and slid a thick stack of carbon copy forms across the laminate surface, the paper rasping loudly against the desk as he tapped a thick index finger against the signature line of the DD 1966 enlistment contract. He informed her, in a flat, rehearsed cadence that suggested he had delivered the exact same speech 100 times that week, that by signing the document she was legally binding herself to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, surrendering her civilian rights to a court-martial panel, and acknowledging that the Army could station her anywhere on the globe based solely on the needs of the service. His voice completely devoid of any inflection or eye contact as he reached for his mouse to wake the sleeping monitor. Naomi picked up the cheap plastic ballpoint pen provided by the office, the smooth barrel feeling alien and insubstantial against the calloused skin of her thumb, and pressed the tip firmly against the Tussaud paper of the signature line, dragging the ink across the page in a slow, deliberate motion that tore slightly through the top layer of the carbon copy. The sharp, scratching sound of the pen filling the brief silence between the rattling of the air conditioner and the distant, muffled hum of highway traffic outside. Before she had walked into the building, Naomi had stood in the parking lot and executed a meticulous, physically agonizing process of concealment, untying the heavy leather laces of her left combat boot and sliding the original, notarized pages of her father's irrevocable trust documents, detailing the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the exact financial trail that led directly to General Caldwell's illicit slush fund, into the narrow, dark cavity between the insole and the steel toe cap. She had spent 20 minutes carefully relacing the boot, pulling the thick nylon cords tight enough to restrict the blood flow to her toes, ensuring that the thick stack of multi-million-dollar legal evidence was compressed into a microscopic, unnoticeable ridge against her ankle, completely invisible to the casual observer, and entirely immune to the superficial pat-downs of the initial military processing. Now, as she signed her name on the final page of the enlistment contract, she could feel the rigid edge of the folded trust documents pressing sharply against the side of her foot, with every slight shift of her weight, a constant, physical pressure that served as a grounding mechanism, tethering her mind to the vast hidden resources at her disposal, while she voluntarily submitted herself to the lowest, most powerless rung of the very hierarchy she intended to dismantle from the inside out. She capped the pen with a sharp plastic click and slid the stack of forms back across the desk, her face remaining a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness as Recruiter Hayes finally looked up from his screen, his eyes briefly scanning her impassive expression before he reached out to collect the paperwork, the dry skin of his fingers brushing against the edge of the desk with a faint papery whisper. He handed her a manila folder containing her shipping instructions, his voice dropping into a slightly more conversational, albeit still dismissive, register as he told her to report to the military entrance processing station at 0400 hours the following Monday, warning her that the physical examinations would be invasive and the aptitude testing would be grueling, his tone implying that she would likely wash out before ever seeing the inside of a basic training barracks. Naomi stood up, the joints of her knees popping faintly in the quiet room, and took the folder, her fingers tracing the embossed seal of the Department of Defense on the cover, feeling the heavy, textured paper that represented her legal transition from a civilian heiress hiding in plain sight to an enlisted soldier bound by oath, law, and an unbreakable, silent promise to the ghost of a man who had died waiting for a justice that only she could now extract. The transport bus groaned to a halt at the edge of the parade ground at Fort Liberty, the heavy pneumatic doors hissing open with a sharp release of pressurized air that carried the scent of diesel exhaust, hot asphalt, and the distinct metallic tang of polished brass and floor wax. Naomi stepped down onto the cracked concrete, the heavy canvas duffel bag slung over her right shoulder, digging sharply into her collarbone, the rough fabric of her uniform already clinging to the damp skin of her back as the brutal, unforgiving North Carolina sun beat down upon the vast expanse of the training facility. The parade ground stretched out before her like a grid of blinding, heat-shimmering gray tarmac, bordered by rows of identical red-brick barracks buildings whose windows reflected the harsh sunlight like 100 unblinking, judgmental eyes, while the air was filled with the chaotic, overlapping symphony of military indoctrination, from the distant, rhythmic thud of marching boots to the sharp, guttural shouts of drill instructors echoing across the open space. She fell into the designated assembly area, joining a ragged line of other new recruits who stood in nervous, shifting silence, their eyes darting around the massive compound while the dry, hot wind whipped dust across the pavement, stinging their faces and coating their lips in a fine, gritty layer of red clay. For 3 hours they stood at the position of attention under the blistering sun, the heat radiating off the tarmac in visible, wavy distortions that made the distant tree line shimmer and dance, while a senior drill sergeant paced the length of the formation, the sharp, rhythmic clack of his campaign hat brim tapping against his hot thigh serving as a metronome for their growing physical exhaustion. Naomi's posture remained perfectly rigid, her heels locked together, her thumbs aligned precisely with the seams of her trousers, her gaze fixed straight ahead on the distant, flag-draped reviewing stand, even as a cold sheen of sweat broke across her hairline and traced a slow, agonizingly itchy path down the side of her neck, pooling in the collar of her uniform. Her calves began to tremble with a fine, involuntary spasm, the muscles burning with lactic acid as she fought the overwhelming biological urge to shift her weight or wipe the stinging sweat from her eyes. Her breathing reduced to shallow, measured sips of the hot, dusty air, her jaw locked so tightly that a dull, throbbing ache radiated from her temporomandibular joint down to the base of her skull. The physical discomfort was absolute, a deliberate, systemic stripping of civilian comfort designed to break the individual down into a compliant, uniform component. But Naomi welcomed the burning in her muscles and the stinging in her eyes, using the physical agony to anchor her mind, to burn away the lingering fatigue of the past week, and to forge the cold, impenetrable armor she would need to survive the months of psychological attrition that lay ahead. The low mechanical hum of an approaching motorcade cut through the distant shouts of the drill sergeants, the sound growing rapidly into a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the soles of Naomi's boots and resonated in the hollow cavity of her chest. A convoy of 3 black armored SUVs rolled onto the perimeter of the parade ground, their tinted windows reflecting the blinding sun, as they came to a synchronized screeching halt at the base of the reviewing stand, the heavy doors opening in rapid succession to reveal a cadre of high-ranking officers in crisp, immaculate dress uniforms. General Thomas Caldwell stepped out of the lead vehicle, his movements slow, deliberate, and heavy with the absolute, unchallenged authority of a man who had spent 4 decades bending the military justice system to his personal will, his polished black dress shoes clicking sharply against the concrete as he ascended the wooden steps of the stand. He was a towering figure, his chest heavily decorated with a blinding array of ribbons and medals that clinked softly against the dark wool of his uniform. With every measured breath he took, the silver stars gleaming on his collar, catching the sunlight and casting brief, sharp reflections across the sweat-slicked faces of the recruits standing at attention below. As Caldwell approached the podium, the public address system crackled to life with a burst of sharp electronic static that made Naomi's teeth ache, followed by the deep, resonant boom of his voice echoing across the vast expanse of the tarmac, distorted slightly by the cheap outdoor speakers but carrying an undeniable, crushing weight of institutional power. He began to speak about duty, about honor, about the sacred trust of the uniform, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that rolled over the formation like a physical pressure, his eyes scanning the sea of young, exhausted faces with a look of detached, clinical appraisal that reminded Naomi instantly of the way a butcher evaluates a side of beef. The sound of his voice triggered a violent, involuntary physiological response. Her pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her collarbone. her breath catching sharply in her throat as a sudden icy coldness flooded her veins, completely at odds with the blistering heat of the sun beating down on her shoulders. In a fraction of a second, the blinding parade ground faded, replaced by the dim, smoke-filled interior of her father's study 15 years prior, the memory washing over her with the vivid, suffocating clarity of a drowning victim breaking the surface. She saw Samuel Bell sitting in his worn leather armchair, his face illuminated only by the amber glow of a desk lamp, his large, scarred hands shaking as he held a redacted JAG summary, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely carried over the sound of the ceiling fan as he pointed a trembling finger at a black-and-white photograph of a younger, smiling Thomas Caldwell. Samuel had told her, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound grief and suppressed rage, that Caldwell was a parasite in polished brass, a man who would sell out his own platoon to cover a logistical deficit, a man who viewed the uniform code of military justice not as a shield for the innocent, but as a loaded weapon to be aimed at anyone who threatened his ascent up the chain of command. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the harsh electronic feedback of the PA system snapping Naomi back to the present reality, the blinding sun, the shimmering tarmac, and the towering figure of General Caldwell standing on the reviewing stand, his voice booming across the formation. Entirely unaware that the daughter of the man he had destroyed was standing less than 50 yards away, breathing the same hot, dusty air and waiting for the exact moment to pull the trigger. The supply closet situated at the end of the dimly lit, cinder-block corridor of the barracks smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach, damp concrete, and the faint, lingering odor of old dust trapped within the ventilation grates, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere that seemed to press against Naomi's lungs with every measured breath she took. She stood perfectly still beside the towering metal shelving units, her hands methodically organizing boxes of standardized inventory items, while the single, flickering fluorescent tube above her head emitted a low, erratic electrical buzz that vibrated directly against her molars and cast long, wavering shadows across the stacked cardboard. The heavy, reinforced steel door at the entrance of the closet suddenly swung inward with a violent, metallic screech that echoed sharply off the narrow walls, the sudden influx of hallway air disrupting the stagnant chemical-heavy atmosphere and carrying with it the distinct, sharp scent of peppermint antacids and stale, unfiltered tobacco. Master Sergeant Miller stepped into the confined space, his massive frame instantly dominating the room as his heavy, black leather combat boots struck the linoleum floor with a deliberate, heavy-footed rhythm that shook the dust from the top shelf, his eyes locked onto Naomi with a cold, predatory intensity that mirrored the exact same look of bureaucratic malice she had seen in the photographs of the tribunal officers who had destroyed her father. He did not speak immediately, allowing the suffocating silence to stretch and tighten like a physical wire across the room, while he slowly unclasped the heavy canvas belt from his waist, the thick leather creaking in protest before he let it drop onto a nearby sorting table, with a heavy, resonant thud that made the plastic inventory bins rattle in their compartments. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the overhead light. Yet it possessed a sharp vitriolic edge that cut through the small space as he informed her, in a tone dripping with institutional contempt, that her persistent, unauthorized inquiries regarding the 1998 logistics audit had been noted by the command staff and were no longer being tolerated as the harmless curiosity of a naive recruit. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could see the broken capillaries in his eyes and feel the radiating heat of his body. His voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper as he told her that she was a glitch in his perfectly ordered supply chain, a messy, insolent anomaly who needed to fix her attitude immediately, or he would personally ensure she was broken down and discharged before she ever saw the inside of a deployed unit. Naomi's jaw locked so tightly that a dull, throbbing ache radiated from her temporomandibular joint down to the base of her skull, a cold sheen of perspiration breaking across her hairline and tracing a slow, icy path down the side of her neck. But she did not take a single step backward, her posture remaining rigidly straight as she kept her gaze fixed entirely on the polished brass insignia on his collar, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of eye contact. Her pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her collarbone, the physical sensation of her own heartbeat thudding loudly in her ears. Yet her breathing remained shallow and perfectly controlled, her hands resting flat against the cold, smooth surface of the metal shelving unit to conceal the slight involuntary trembling in her fingers that the sheer, overwhelming aggression of his proximity had triggered. Miller slammed his heavy palm against the side of the nearest metal locker, the impact producing a deafening, metallic clang that rang through the small room like a struck bell, the violent vibration traveling up the shelving unit and into the palms of her hands. But she merely blinked once, her facial muscles remaining entirely slack and impassive as she waited for him to finish his theatrical display of authority. He leaned in even closer, his breath washing over her face in a hot, stale wave, and explicitly threatened her with a summary court-martial under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice for failure to obey a lawful order, his words hanging in the chemically scented air as a direct, unmistakable promise of professional destruction if she ever asked about the missing pallets of the 1998 fiscal year again. Naomi slowly drew a single measured breath through her nose, the cold, bleach-scented air filling her lungs and steadying the frantic beating of her heart, before she parted her lips and spoke in a voice that was entirely devoid of inflection, flat and cold as polished stone, stating clearly that her inquiries were fully documented in her personal log, that her attitude was in strict accordance with Army regulations, and that she would require his threats to be submitted in writing, on an official memorandum for her records. The sheer, unexpected audacity of her calm, bureaucratic response seemed to momentarily short-circuit his anger, his face flushing a deep, mottled red as he stared at her, his chest heaving beneath his uniform shirt while the silence in the closet stretched into a heavy, suffocating weight, broken only by the rattling of the ventilation grate and the ragged sound of his own breathing. He took a slow step back, his boots squeaking faintly against the scuffed linoleum, his eyes narrowing into thin, malicious slits as he realized that his intimidation tactics were sliding off her impassive demeanor like water off oiled canvas, leaving him exposed and powerless in the confined space. He snatched his heavy leather belt from the sorting table, the brass buckle clinking sharply against the metal surface, and threaded it through the loops of his trousers with a series of sharp, aggressive jerks, his jaw working silently as he glared at her with a profound, calculating hatred that promised future, more insidious retaliation. Without uttering another word, he turned on his heel and marched out of the supply closet, his heavy boots striking the floor in a rapid, angry cadence that faded down the corridor, leaving the heavy steel door slightly ajar and allowing the cool, drafty air of the hallway to wash over Naomi's sweat-dampened uniform. She remained standing in the exact same position for a full 3 minutes after his footsteps had completely disappeared, her hands still pressed flat against the cold metal, waiting until the violent trembling in her calves had entirely subsided and the copper taste of adrenaline had faded from the back of her throat before she finally allowed herself to exhale a long, shaky breath and resume her inventory count. The subterranean archives room located deep beneath the headquarters building was a vast, cavernous space that smelled intensely of decaying cellulose, dry rot, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone generated by the aging climate control system, the air heavy and stagnant beneath the low, acoustic tile ceiling. Naomi sat alone at a scarred wooden examination table in the center of the room, the only illumination provided by the harsh, localized glare of a single articulated desk lamp that cast long, sharp shadows across the stacks of declassified cardboard boxes and the towering metal shelving units that disappeared into the gloom at the edges of the room. She wore a pair of pristine white cotton gloves that snapped faintly against her wrists as she carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages of a massive leather-bound 1998 payroll ledger, the dry paper rasping softly against the fabric with a sound like dead leaves scraping across a stone patio. The only other noise in the immense space was the deep, rhythmic mechanical thrum of the industrial HVAC unit, working tirelessly to maintain the precise humidity levels required to preserve the decaying historical records. A constant, low-frequency vibration that she could feel resonating through the soles of her boots and up into her shins. As she carefully aligned the edge of the open payroll ledger with a thick, heavily redacted Judge Advocate General Summary report, the musty, dust-choked scent of the aging documents suddenly triggered a vivid, involuntary physiological memory, transporting her mind instantly back to the cramped, grease-stained kitchen of the diner in Fayetteville nearly 15 years prior. She could suddenly feel the intense, radiating heat of the commercial flat-top grill against her face, smell the overwhelming, suffocating odor of burnt coffee and frying bacon fat that clung to her hair and skin, and hear the relentless, chaotic symphony of clattering ceramic plates, hissing espresso machines, and the sharp, electronic ringing of the order ticket printer. In the memory, she was standing behind the stainless steel counter at 3 a.m, her feet throbbing with a deep, dull ache inside her non-slip shoes, her fingers stained with ink and flour as she meticulously counted a crumpled, disorganized pile of $1 bills and quarters under the flickering fluorescent light of the register. She was counting the meager, exhausted tips from the graveyard shift, her mind entirely focused on the exact, terrifying mathematics of the cost of a replacement albuterol inhaler for her younger brother, whose shallow, wheezing breathing from the back room served as a constant, terrifying metronome to her frantic labor, a physical reminder of the crushing, inescapable weight of their poverty, while the men in uniform drank their coffee in the booths, entirely oblivious to the desperate, silent calculations keeping her family alive. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the sharp, mechanical click of the desk lamp's adjustment knob, snapping her attention back to the cold, subterranean reality of the archives room, her gloved finger coming to a sudden, abrupt halt on the lower right quadrant of the open payroll ledger. She leaned closer to the page, her eyes narrowing as she scrutinized a specific column of numerical entries detailing the hazardous duty pay disbursements for the third quarter, her breath catching slightly in her throat as she noticed a profound, undeniable discrepancy in the physical texture of the ink. The standard typed entries on the page were printed in a uniform, matte black dot matrix font that had faded slightly to a dull charcoal gray over the decades. But the 3 specific line items she was currently examining were rendered in a slightly darker, glossier shade of blue-black ink, the typewriter strikes pressing marginally deeper into the fibrous paper, indicating they had been added at a completely different time, using a completely different machine. She reached into the pocket of her uniform blouse and retrieved a small, high-powered jeweler's loupe, bringing the magnifying glass directly over the anomalous entries, the enhanced optics revealing the microscopic, jagged edges of the typewriter font that perfectly matched the serial number of the personal Underwood typewriter her father had kept in his home office, a machine that had been officially logged as destroyed in a barracks fire 2 weeks before the audit. Her heart rate accelerated, a steady, powerful thudding against her ribs that echoed in the quiet of the archives room. But her hands remained perfectly steady, entirely devoid of the trembling that had plagued her in the supply closet, as she carefully positioned her personal encrypted digital camera on a small adjustable tripod mounted to the edge of the table. She adjusted the focal ring with a series of soft, mechanical clicks, ensuring the depth of field was perfectly calibrated to capture both the macroscopic discrepancy in the ink shade and the microscopic indentation of the typewriter keys. The cool blue light of the camera's LCD screen illuminating the lower half of her face in the dim room. She pressed the shutter release button, the sharp electronic chirp of the camera cutting through the low hum of the HVAC system, followed immediately by the bright momentary flash of the macro lens that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air above the ledger. She took the photograph again from a slightly different angle, the shutter clicking a second time, then a third, documenting the exact page number, the specific line items, and the adjacent redacted blocks of the JAG summary that corresponded perfectly to the forged entries, methodically establishing an unbroken, undeniable chain of visual evidence that would eventually serve as the foundation for the total, systemic dismantling of the men who had stolen her father's life. The subterranean confinement cell radiated a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to bypass the heavy wool of her uniform and settle directly into the marrow of her bones, forcing a violent, uncontrollable shudder to ripple through her shoulders as the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor slammed shut with a deafening, metallic finality that echoed through the windowless concrete bunker. Naomi sat rigidly on the edge of the narrow, steel-framed cot, the thin, scratchy blanket doing nothing to ward off the freezing air that circulated through the rusted ventilation grate near the ceiling, while the single, caged fluorescent bulb above her head emitted a low, erratic electrical buzz that vibrated against her molars and cast long, wavering shadows across the cinder block walls. The physical reality of her isolation was absolute, a calculated, systemic dismantling of her career orchestrated by General Caldwell's network, who had first transferred her to a desolate, sub-basement motor pool assignment, then revoked her security clearance, and finally slapped her with a fabricated charge sheet alleging violations of Article 92 and Article 107 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice for supposedly falsifying logistics, manifests, and insubordination toward Master Sergeant Miller. The psychological pressure had been intensified by a series of anonymous, devastating retaliations against the few people who had shown her kindness, including a sudden, retroactive audit of the disability pension belonging to the elderly artilleryman in the wheelchair who had handed her the folded flag, and the abrupt cancellation of a sympathetic supply clerk's pending deployment orders, effectively sending a clear, unmistakable message that anyone associated with Private Bell would be financially and professionally ruined. A cold sheen of perspiration broke across her hairline, tracing a slow icy path down the side of her neck and pooling in the collar of her shirt, while her knees began to tremble with a fine involuntary spasm that she fought desperately to suppress by pressing the soles of her boots flat against the freezing linoleum floor. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her thighs, and pressed her forehead against the rough, freezing surface of the cinder block wall, the abrasive concrete scraping against her skin and drawing a single, microscopic bead of blood that mixed with the sweat on her upper lip, filling her mouth with the sharp, metallic taste of copper. In the suffocating silence of the cell, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere deep within the plumbing of the barracks, her mind involuntarily fractured, slipping backward through time to the sterile, antiseptic air of the Veterans Affairs ward, where her father had taken his final rattling breath. The memory washed over her with the vivid, suffocating clarity of a drowning victim breaking the surface, the distant dripping of the pipe morphing seamlessly into the sharp, unbroken tone of the flatlining heart monitor, while the freezing concrete beneath her forehead transformed into the crinkling, sterile paper of the hospital bed where Samuel Bell had lain defeated, his reputation stripped away by the very men who were now systematically crushing his daughter beneath the weight of the military justice system. Her pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her collarbone, the physical sensation of her own heartbeat thudding loudly in her ears as the sheer, overwhelming gravity of her predicament, threatened to shatter the icy composure she had meticulously constructed over the past 6 months, leaving her staring into the abyss of a dishonorable discharge that would perfectly mirror the bureaucratic execution her father had suffered. She closed her eyes, drawing a single measured breath through her nose, the cold, bleach-scented air filling her lungs and steadying the frantic beating of her heart, forcing her mind to reject the paralyzing terror and instead focus on the rigid, unbreakable edge of the microSD card and the folded trust documents hidden deep inside the heel of her left combat boot, the physical pressure of the hidden evidence against her ankle serving as the only anchor keeping her from slipping entirely into the dark, crushing weight of her despair. The Judge Advocate General's office was a cavernous, intimidating space that smelled intensely of lemon polish, aged leather, and the faint, expensive scent of cedarwood cologne. The heavy mahogany desk dominating the room like a fortress designed to separate the powerful from the powerless. Captain Vance sat behind the massive expanse of polished wood, his posture rigid and his expression carefully arranged into a mask of bureaucratic indifference, while the heavy grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to measure out the remaining seconds of Naomi's military career. He slid a thick, cream-colored manila envelope across the smooth surface of the desk, the paper rasping loudly in the quiet room as he tapped a manicured index finger against the signature line of a non-disclosure agreement and a medical discharge form, his voice dripping with a calm, institutional contempt as he informed her that the command was willing to offer her a graceful exit if she simply signed the papers, accepted a Chapter 11 discharge for the good of the service, and agreed to never speak of the 1998 logistics audit or the fabricated charges currently sitting in her permanent file. He leaned back in his leather chair, the material creaking softly beneath his weight, and explicitly detailed the devastating consequences of her refusal, his tone shifting into a low, vitriolic rasp as he warned her that the trial counsel was fully prepared to pursue a court-martial that would not only strip her of her freedom but would also permanently revoke her brother's VA medical benefits and ensure that the elderly veteran who had foolishly offered her his support would be audited into absolute poverty. Naomi did not reach for the pen, nor did she look at the envelope, her face remaining a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness as she slowly uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her movements deliberate and unhurried, entirely devoid of the panic that Vance had clearly expected to see breaking through her disciplined exterior. She reached down to her left foot, her fingers moving with a practiced, mechanical precision as she untied the heavy nylon laces of her combat boot, pulling the thick leather tongue aside to reveal the narrow, hidden cavity between the insole and the steel toe cap, where she had concealed the physical remnants of her family's hidden empire. She extracted a thick stack of notarized multi-million-dollar trust documents and a sleek, encrypted micro-SD card, placing them gently onto the polished mahogany desk with a soft, deliberate thud that seemed to echo loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his, with a cold, piercing intensity that made him instinctively shift his weight, and spoke in a voice that was entirely devoid of inflection, flat and sharp as a scalpel, stating clearly that she was not the daughter of a disgraced enlisted man, but the sole heir to the Bell family irrevocable trust, and that the micro-SD card contained the complete, unredacted financial ledgers of the offshore shell companies General Caldwell had used to funnel $2 million of classified logistics funds into his personal retirement accounts. The sheer, unexpected magnitude of her revelation seemed to physically strike him, his face instantly draining of color until his skin took on a sickly, ashen pallor, a cold sheen of sweat breaking out across his upper lip as his eyes darted frantically from the trust documents to the encrypted drive, his breathing suddenly becoming shallow and rapid as the full, terrifying reality of his miscalculation crashed down upon him. Naomi did not allow him a moment to recover, her voice remaining perfectly level and commanding, as she informed him that she had already retained a team of former federal prosecutors through her family's legal counsel, that a temporary restraining order had been filed in federal district court, freezing all of Caldwell's domestic and offshore assets as of 0600 hours that morning, and that she was not walking away with a quiet medical discharge, but was instead formally subpoenaing his personal financial records under Title 10 whistleblower protection statutes. Captain Vance's hands began to tremble violently, his fingers hovering inches above the desk as a single drop of sweat detached from his temple and traced a slow path down his cheek, his authoritative posture entirely collapsing as his knees buckled slightly beneath the desk, the heavy leather chair groaning in protest as he slumped forward, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The grandfather clock continued its slow, deliberate ticking, the sound now seeming impossibly loud in the dead, crushing silence of the office, while Naomi sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the physical manifestation of the military justice system crumble before her eyes, the cold, hard resolve in her chest finally solidifying into an unbreakable, terrifying certainty that the war had officially begun. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, situated at the end of a cracked asphalt parking lot, smelled intensely of stale draft beer, damp wool, and the sharp, acrid tang of cheap cigar smoke, creating a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that clung to the faded green wallpaper and the scuffed linoleum floor. Naomi Bell sat rigidly in a cracked vinyl booth near the back of the room, her spine perfectly aligned with the seam of the seat, her hands resting flat on the sticky formica table to conceal the faint, residual trembling in her fingers that had persisted since she walked out of the subterranean confinement cell. The single neon sign in the window buzzed with a low, erratic electrical hum that vibrated directly against her molars, casting a sickly, flickering red pallor over the scarred surface of the table and the thick stack of legal pads she had arranged with meticulous, geometric precision. Across from her sat Elias Thorne, a 70-year-old former artilleryman confined to a motorized wheelchair, his hands resting on the padded armrests, his skin the texture of crumpled parchment, and his eyes clouded with the milky haze of cataracts that barely obscured the sharp, calculating intelligence still burning behind them. The sharp, metallic scent of the VFW hall suddenly triggered a violent, involuntary physiological memory, transporting Naomi's mind instantly back to the cramped, grease-stained kitchen of the diner in Fayetteville nearly 15 years prior, the memory washing over her with the vivid, suffocating clarity of a drowning victim breaking the surface. She could suddenly feel the intense, radiating heat of the commercial flat-top grill against her face, smell the overwhelming, suffocating odor of burnt coffee and frying bacon fat that clung to her hair and skin, and hear the relentless, chaotic symphony of clattering ceramic plates and the sharp electronic ringing of the order ticket printer. In the memory, she was standing behind the stainless steel counter at 3 a.m, her feet throbbing with a deep, dull ache inside her non-slip shoes, her fingers stained with ink and flour as she meticulously counted a crumpled, disorganized pile of $1 bills and quarters under the flickering fluorescent light of the register, her mind entirely focused on the exact, terrifying mathematics of the cost of a replacement albuterol inhaler for her younger brother, whose shallow, wheezing breathing from the back room served as a constant, terrifying metronome to her frantic labor, a physical reminder of the crushing, inescapable weight of their poverty, while the men in uniform drank their coffee in the booths, entirely oblivious to the desperate, silent calculations keeping her family alive, completely unaware that the man whose name was stamped with a red dishonorable discharge was the same man who had secretly paid for that brother's inhaler out of his own meager, stripped pension, carrying the burdens of his broken brothers long after the Pentagon had discarded him. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the sharp, mechanical whir of Elias' wheelchair motor snapping her attention back to the cold, smoke-choked reality of the VFW hall, the old man slowly reaching into the deep canvas pocket of his faded field jacket, with a hand that shook with a fine rhythmic palsy. He withdrew a heavy triangular canvas case, the fabric worn soft at the edges and stained with the faint brownish discoloration of old sweat and rain, the thick nylon straps clinking softly against the metal frame of his chair as he placed it onto the sticky formica table with a heavy, deliberate thud. Elias did not speak immediately, allowing the suffocating silence to stretch and tighten like a physical wire across the booth while he slowly unzipped the main compartment, the metallic teeth of the zipper rasping loudly in the quiet space, revealing the tightly folded, heavy silk of a ceremonial United States flag, its crisp, geometric folds untouched by the decades of neglect. He reached past the flag, his trembling fingers probing the thick, velvet-lined interior of the casing, before slowly extracting a small, rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth, the fabric crinkling sharply as he peeled it back to reveal a leather-bound, water-stained field journal, the cover cracked and peeling, the brass clasp tarnished to a dull, oxidized green. He pushed the journal across the table, his knuckles brushing the formica with a dry, papery whisper, his chest heaving beneath his faded jacket as he drew a slow, ragged breath that rattled deep within his lungs. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the neon sign. Yet it possessed a sharp, emotional weight that cut through the small space as he informed her, in a tone dripping with a slow, choked reverence, that this was the original, unredacted after-action report from the 1998 logistics deployment, the physical proof that Colonel Samuel Bell had never authorized the transfer of the munitions funds, a document he had kept hidden inside the lining of his burial flag because the men in Washington had tried to bury the truth in paperwork, stacking redactions and classified stamps over their sins until the paper became a tomb. Elias leaned forward, the leather of his wheelchair creaking softly beneath his weight, his milky eyes locking onto Naomi's impassive face as his voice dropped into a slow, philosophical cadence, telling her that her father had carried them when the brass left them in the dirt, taking the fall for a syndicate of cowards in polished brass, so that the enlisted men could go home to their families, and that she had brought his name back to the light, pulling his honor out of the grave when the entire machinery of the government had conspired to keep him buried. Naomi's jaw locked so tightly that a dull, throbbing ache radiated from her temporomandibular joint down to the base of her skull, a cold sheen of perspiration breaking across her hairline. But she did not take a single step backward, her posture remaining rigidly straight as she reached out and placed her hand flat over the cracked leather of the journal, feeling the rough, textured surface beneath her palm. She looked up, her gaze steady and entirely devoid of inflection, and spoke in a voice that was flat and cold as polished stone, stating clearly that the chain of custody was intact, that the exculpatory evidence was secured, and that the men who built this tomb were about to be buried inside it. The Article 32 preliminary hearing room was a cavernous, intimidating space paneled in dark, polished mahogany that absorbed the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, the air heavily conditioned to a biting, sterile chill that seemed to press against the lungs and carry the faint, metallic tang of ozone and floor wax. Naomi stood perfectly still behind the heavy oak podium at the center of the room, her hands resting flat on the smooth, varnished surface to conceal the faint, residual coldness in her fingers, while the heavy, soundproofed doors at the back of the room remained sealed shut, locking out the ambient noise of the headquarters corridor. Across the wide expanse of the polished floor, General Thomas Caldwell sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and his expression carefully arranged into a mask of arrogant institutional indifference, his chest heavily decorated with a blinding array of ribbons and medals that clinked softly against the dark wool of his uniform with every measured, dismissive breath he took. He was flanked by two senior judge advocate general officers in crisp, immaculate dress uniforms, their legal pads stacked in perfect alignment, their pens hovering over the paper as they waited for the presiding investigating officer to call the room to order, the heavy, suffocating silence of the room broken only by the rapid, staccato clatter of the court reporter's stenotype machine in the corner, the sharp, rhythmic clicking serving as a mechanical metronome for the impending execution of Naomi's career. The presiding officer, a stern-faced colonel, with graying hair and a reputation for strict procedural adherence, struck the heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp, resonant crack echoing off the mahogany panels and instantly silencing the low, ambient hum of the room's ventilation system. He adjusted his reading glasses, the wire frames catching the harsh overhead light, and looked down at Naomi with a detached, clinical appraisal, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone as he called upon Private Bell to present her rebuttal evidence regarding the fabricated charges of falsifying logistics manifests and insubordination. Naomi did not hesitate, her movements deliberate and unhurried as she reached into the pocket of her uniform blouse and extracted a sleek, encrypted micro SD card, the small piece of black plastic catching the light for a fraction of a second before she slid it into the USB port of the podium's integrated terminal, the sharp, mechanical click of the connection echoing loudly in the dead silence of the room. She pressed a sequence of keys, her fingers moving with a practiced, mechanical precision, and the heavy motorized projector screen at the front of the room whirred to life, descending from the ceiling with a soft, mechanical hum before illuminating with a blinding high-definition projection of a complex, multi-layered financial ledger, the bright blue light washing over the dark wood of the room and casting long, sharp shadows across the faces of the defense team. She turned to face the room, her posture perfectly rigid, her voice projecting in a clear, resonant cadence that cut through the cold air without the need for the microphone, stating for the official record that the document currently displayed on the screen was the unredacted, offshore financial ledger of the Apex Holdings Shell Company, a corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands that had received exactly $2,450,000 in misappropriated logistics funds between the fiscal years of 1998 and 2004. She paused, allowing the sheer, overwhelming density of the numbers to settle over the room, the bright blue light of the projector reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes, before she reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew the cracked, leather-bound field journal, placing it gently onto the podium with a soft, deliberate thud that seemed to echo loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence. She informed the investigating officer that this was the original, unredacted after-action report from the 1998 deployment, physically authenticated by the sworn affidavit of Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, which explicitly proved that Colonel Samuel Bell had never authorized the transfer of the munitions funds, and that the signature on the forged transfer order currently sitting in the government's evidence file was a crude, undeniably fraudulent replication. General Caldwell's face, which had been locked in a mask of arrogant indifference, suddenly flushed a deep, mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging against the stiff collar of his uniform, as he slammed his heavy palm against the mahogany table, the impact producing a deafening wooden crack that made the court reporter flinch and the JAG officers jump in their seats. He surged to his feet, his heavy leather chair scraping violently against the polished floor, his chest heaving beneath his medals as he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Naomi, his voice rising into a harsh, vitriolic shout that echoed off the high ceiling, screaming that she was a fraud, a disgruntled, insolent enlisted rat who had fabricated documents to extort the command, a messy, insubordinate glitch who didn't know her place and needed to be silenced before she destroyed the reputation of the officer corps. The sheer, overwhelming aggression of his outburst filled the room, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization that the impenetrable armor of his rank and his network had just been shattered by a single, lowly private. Naomi did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice, her facial muscles remaining entirely slack and impassive. As she waited for his shouting to echo into silence, the cold blue light of the projector illuminating the cold sweat that had suddenly broken out across his forehead and was now tracing a slow, icy path down his temple. She leaned slightly forward, resting her weight on the podium, and spoke in a voice that was entirely devoid of inflection, flat and sharp as a scalpel, stating clearly that the general was out of order, that his emotional outburst was a matter of public record, and that the metadata on the forged signature file proved it was created on a personal Underwood typewriter logged to his private office, a fact that the federal subpoena currently being served to his legal counsel would inevitably confirm. She watched, her gaze locked onto his, as the sheer unexpected magnitude of her tactical counterattack physically struck him, his face instantly draining of color until his skin took on a sickly, ashen pallor, his mouth opening and closing silently as the full terrifying reality of his exposure crashed down upon him. His knees began to tremble with a fine involuntary spasm, the heavy wool of his trousers shaking visibly as his legs lost their structural integrity, his breathing becoming shallow, rapid, and entirely uncontrolled. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, the heavy material groaning in protest under his sudden dead weight, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the walls of his carefully constructed empire closed in around him. Naomi stood perfectly still in the blinding blue light of the projector, her hands folded neatly over the cracked leather journal, watching the physical manifestation of the military justice system crumble before her eyes, the cold, hard resolve in her chest finally solidifying into an unbreakable, terrifying certainty as she reached into her pocket and her fingers brushed the smooth, corrected surface of her father's restored DD-214. The heavy, polished mahogany of the defense table absorbed the dull, sickening thud of General Caldwell's chest as his physical structural integrity finally failed, his knees buckling completely beneath the weight of his own collapsing empire, while the two senior judge advocate general officers flanking him scrambled backward in a chaotic symphony of scraping leather chairs and scattered legal pads. The presiding investigating officer did not flinch at the sudden commotion, his face remaining a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness as he raised the heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, resonant crack that cut through the panicked whispers of the gallery like a physical blade, the sound echoing off the dark wood paneling and instantly silencing the room, except for the shallow, ragged gasps of the disgraced general slumped against the edge of the table. The military police officers stationed at the rear of the courtroom moved forward with a synchronized, heavy-footed rhythm, their black leather boots striking the polished floor in a deliberate cadence that vibrated through the soles of Naomi's boots, the sharp, metallic ratchet of the steel handcuffs echoing with a series of rapid, mechanical clicks as they secured Caldwell's wrists behind his back, the cold steel biting into the skin of a man who had spent 4 decades using his rank to shield himself from the consequences of his own actions. Naomi remained standing perfectly still behind the heavy oak podium, her hands resting flat on the smooth, varnished surface to conceal the faint, residual coldness in her fingers, her posture rigidly straight as she watched the physical manifestation of the military justice system dismantle the man who had destroyed her father, her pulse maintaining a steady, measured rhythm against her collarbone while a cold sheen of perspiration traced a slow path down the side of her neck. The presiding officer adjusted his reading glasses, the wire frames catching the harsh, overhead fluorescent light, and looked down at the official court reporter, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone that carried the undeniable, crushing weight of institutional authority as he formally directed the recorder to note that the charges of falsifying logistics, manifests, and insubordination against Private Naomi Bell were dismissed with prejudice. and that the secondary findings of the Article 32 hearing had established probable cause to refer General Thomas Caldwell to a general court-martial under Articles 133 and 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice for conduct unbecoming an officer and fraud against the United States. The sharp, staccato clatter of the stenotype machine filled the brief silence, the mechanical metronome recording the exact second the impenetrable armor of Caldwell's rank was officially stripped away, while the JAG officers at the defense table frantically shuffled their papers, their faces drained of color, their breathing shallow and rapid as they realized their client was no longer a protected asset but a federal liability. The presiding officer then reached into the leather folio in front of him, extracting a single thick sheet of heavy cream-colored paper bearing the embossed seal of the Department of the Army, his voice dropping into a slightly slower, more deliberate cadence as he addressed the secondary matter of the historical record, stating for the official transcript that the evidence presented had conclusively proven the 1998 tribunal against Colonel Samuel Bell was predicated on forged documentation and perjured testimony, and that pursuant to the authority vested in this command, the dishonorable discharge was hereby vacated, the record was fully expunged, and the rank of colonel was posthumously restored with all accompanying honors and benefits. He slid the heavy paper across the smooth surface of the podium, the dry rasp of the thick cardstock sounding impossibly loud in the dead silence of the room, and Naomi reached out with a steady hand to take the corrected DD-214, her fingers brushing the crisp, clean edge of the document, where the red stamp of disgrace had been physically crossed out and replaced with the black ink of official vindication. The tactile sensation of the heavy paper beneath her thumb instantly triggered a violent, involuntary physiological memory, transporting her mind back to the sterile, antiseptic air of the Veterans Affairs ward, where the heart monitor had dissolved into a single, unbroken tone, the distant, muffled sound of the courtroom gallery, shifting in their seats, morphing seamlessly into the rattling, shallow gasp of her father's final breath, while the harsh fluorescent light of the hearing room faded into the dim amber glow of the bedside lamp where Samuel's large, scarred hands had trembled as he held the frayed, coffee-stained original. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the sharp, mechanical clack of the presiding officer's pen capping, snapping her attention back to the cold, mahogany-paneled reality of the courtroom, her jaw locking so tightly that a dull ache radiated from her temples as she folded the corrected DD-214 along its original creases and slid it into the inner pocket of her jacket, feeling the stiff paper press against her ribs like a physical anchor. The military police officers gently but firmly hauled General Caldwell to his feet, his polished black dress shoes scuffing awkwardly against the polished floor as his legs refused to bear his full weight, his chest heaving beneath his medals, the silver stars on his collar catching the light one last time before he was turned and marched down the center aisle, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the MP's boots escorting him out of the room while the heavy, soundproofed doors swung shut behind him with a final, resonant thud that sealed the tomb of his career. Naomi did not smile, nor did she allow her shoulders to drop, her facial muscles remaining entirely slack and impassive as she picked up her canvas bag, the heavy, encrypted micro SD card and the cracked leather field journal resting securely inside, and walked down the side aisle toward the exit, her boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor in a steady, unhurried cadence that echoed through the emptying room, the cold, hard resolve in her chest finally solidifying into an unbreakable, terrifying certainty that the war was over. But the work had just begun. The sprawling expanse of the National Cemetery was a vast geometric grid of pristine green grass and stark white marble headstones, the relentless November rain falling in a cold, steady sheet that turned the air into a gray, misty veil and soaked through the heavy wool of Naomi's dress uniform, plastering her dark hair to her forehead and tracing a slow, icy path down the back of her neck. She knelt on the damp, spongy earth at the base of her father's newly corrected grave marker, the cold mud immediately seeping through the knees of her trousers, biting into her skin with a sharp, penetrating chill that she completely ignored as she used a small steel trowel to carefully dig a narrow, rectangular cavity into the soft soil beneath the granite base. The air smelled intensely of wet earth, decaying autumn leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of the ozone carried in by the storm. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere that muffled the ambient noise of the grounds, leaving only the rhythmic, hollow sound of the rain, striking the marble and the soft, wet scrape of the trowel against the hidden roots of the old oak tree shading the plot. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and withdrew the corrected DD-214, now sealed inside a thick, waterproof plastic casing, the clear plastic beading with condensation from the cold rain as she placed it gently into the excavated cavity, aligning it perfectly parallel to the stone before using the flat edge of the trowel to push the damp, heavy earth back over the plastic, patting the soil down until it was flush with the surrounding grass. The sharp, mechanical whir of a motorized wheelchair cutting through the sound of the rain announced the arrival of Elias Thorne, the old artilleryman rolling slowly up the paved pathway. His faded field jacket pulled tight against the chill, a clear plastic poncho draped over his shoulders, and the motorized chair, the heavy rubber tires hissing faintly against the wet asphalt. He stopped a few feet from the grave, his hands resting on the padded armrests, his milky eyes fixed on the freshly turned earth where the corrected record now lay buried, his chest heaving beneath the wet wool as he drew a slow, ragged breath that rattled deep within his lungs. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the steady drumming of the rain. Yet it possessed a slow, choked reverence that cut through the small space, his words falling in a deliberate, philosophical cadence as he told her that the men in Washington had always believed a red stamp could bury a man's soul, stacking their redactions and their lies until the paper became a tomb. But she had proven that the truth doesn't rot in the ground. It just waits in the dark for someone with the courage to pick up a shovel and dig it back into the light. He paused, his trembling hand reaching up to wipe a mixture of rain and something else from his cheek, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he added that Samuel had carried them when the brass left them in the dirt, taking the fall so the enlisted men could go home, and that she had not just cleared his name, she had rebuilt the foundation they all stood on, proving that honor once isn't something they could take away with a piece of paper. It was something you forged in the fire and carried in your bones. Naomi's jaw locked, a cold sheen of perspiration breaking across her hairline, but she did not take a single step backward, her posture remaining rigidly straight as she stood up from the mud, wiping the damp soil from her knees with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked at Elias, her gaze steady and entirely devoid of inflection, and spoke in a voice that was flat and cold as polished stone, stating clearly that the chain of custody was closed, that the record was corrected, and that the men who built the tomb were now the ones buried inside it. The sharp, rhythmic cadence of marching boots, striking the wet pavement, echoed from the main road, the sound growing rapidly into a unified, heavy thud that vibrated through the soles of Naomi's boots, as a squad of 24 new recruits in their crisp, gray physical training uniforms marched past the cemetery gates, their breath pluming in the cold air, their faces pale and drawn from the grueling morning run. The drill sergeant at the head of the column barked a sharp, guttural command that cut through the sound of the rain, the squad snapping to a simultaneous, flawless halt, their boots striking the pavement with a single deafening crack that echoed off the rows of white headstones. The drill sergeant turned his head, his eyes locking onto Naomi's uniform and the silver insignia on her collar, and barked a second command, the entire squad pivoting in perfect unison to face the grave, their right hands snapping up in a crisp, sharp salute, the sound of their palms striking their brow plates rippling down the line like a wave. Naomi stood perfectly still in the freezing rain, the water soaking through her wool coat and chilling her to the bone, her face remaining a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness as she slowly raised her right hand and returned the salute, her fingers extended perfectly straight, holding the position for 3 long, silent seconds before dropping her hand to her side in a sharp, mechanical motion. She did not speak to the recruits, nor did she offer them a smile of encouragement, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the cemetery gates, her mind already shifting from the personal vindication of her father's name to the systemic dismantling of the JAGI oversight committees. She was scheduled to brief the following Monday. The physical pressure of the multi-million-dollar trust documents still hidden deep inside the heel of her left combat boot, serving as a silent reminder that the resources to rebuild the machine were just as formidable as the resources she had used to break it. She turned and walked back down the wet asphalt pathway, her boots crunching heavily against the gravel, the rain washing away the mud from her trousers, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the dark, stormy sky, ready to begin the long, quiet work of ensuring that no other soldier would ever have to dig their father's honor out of the dirt again.